Well, welcome to the coaching video for Sunday, February 9th. We're in our series 2020 Vision, Looking to Jesus, and this week we're in Matthew 21, verses 1 to 22. And the main idea with this passage is that there's people in this passage who ought to see Jesus clearly, and they fail to see him for who he really is. And the passage, as I'm going to kind of talk about it on Sunday, is there's three main scenes or three main sections in this passage. The first scene is verses 1 to 11, is kind of that Palm Sunday passage where Jesus enters Jerusalem in this sort of kingly procession. The second scene is him in the temple, overturning the tables of the money changers and getting a little upset with the religious leaders there. And then the third scene is after he spends the night outside of Jerusalem, he's on his way back to Jerusalem, and he curses a fig tree, and there's this kind of weird image of what's going on with that. He curses the fig tree, and then he engages in some discussion with his disciples. So there's these three scenes, and where I'm going to probably go with this is kind of this common thread of each of these three scenes represent people who failed to see Jesus clearly, and there was an obstacle identified in each of these scenes that prevents the people from seeing Jesus. Before we jump into that, there's a great question in verse 10. So in this Palm Sunday part, Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, and there's this, sort of stirring. The crowds are responding. They're shouting Hosanna, which means save us. They're throwing their cloaks down on the road and palm branches and creating this procession for Jesus. And at the end of that, in verse 10, it says, when Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" And it's almost, could be taken as a bit of a rhetorical question. It could be what's all this commotion about? And who is this Jesus? And what's going on here? But as I was kind of looking at that question, it's a great question to consider and to discuss with others if you're in a group or with your family or friends. Who is Jesus to you? What's your experience with Jesus been like? As you've journeyed with Jesus, how has he revealed himself to you? How have you experienced him in your life? And maybe share some of the testimonies of who Jesus is to you and to each other. Talk about your experience with him, and out of that even maybe ask some questions. Who is this Jesus? What other questions do you have about him? I think this question can provoke a lot of mystery. If you think about a relationship with somebody, whether it's a husband or wife or a really good friend, when you're in a relationship with somebody, I think our hope is that we would never have that person truly figured out. Part of the mystery of a relationship is learning new things about each other, getting to know each other, the different layers of who somebody is. And I think our fear maybe in a relationship is that somebody would put us in a box, that they would say, "We have you figured out." And sometimes when we do something that maybe seems a little bit out of character, it might provoke this question, like, who is this? Who are you, Craig, when you do that? And I think we can sort of apply that same thinking here to our relationship with Jesus when we ask that question, who is Jesus? We want to be careful that we don't put Jesus in a box, that we don't claim that we have him all figured out. I think one of the dynamics for me in my walk with Jesus is that there is some mystery to it, and that I look forward to learning new things about him and discovering new things about him and experiencing him in my life in new and fresh ways. So I just want to kind of point out that question, who is this Jesus? You can really dive into that in a lot of different ways. But the real thread through this passage that I'm going to be talking about is these obstacles that exist, these obstacles that get in the way of us seeing Jesus clearly. And so in that first scene in this Palm Sunday passage, as Jesus is entering Jerusalem and the crowds are, there's this great stirring and, this response, who is this? But the obstacle there that's preventing people from seeing Jesus clearly is that they have these false expectations about Jesus. Their hope is that Jesus, as the Messiah, would come and restore political peace and bring prosperity to the nation of Israel, that he would even be this sort of warrior king that would come and go to battle against the Roman Empire and sort of kick the Romans, out and restore this sense of lost identity to the nation of Israel. And so they're really looking for a political figure, a warrior king type figure. They're looking for someone to bring just the great reputation that Israel once had under King David or King Solomon. That's what they're longing for. And so this false expectation of who Jesus is and what they want him to do really gets in the way of them seeing him for who he is. And so again, as we think about talking about this with other people in our lives, you could really dive into this question of what are some of the false expectations we have of Jesus? Even in our experience with Jesus or whatever others maybe have told us about what Jesus could do in our lives, do we come to Jesus with expectations of what we want versus really seeing him for who he is and inviting him in and trusting him despite our expectations and maybe the unmet expectations? And so this idea of, false expectations can really prevent us from seeing him clearly. So I encourage you to dive into that. In the next scene, Jesus is in the temple, and there's lots that we could talk about there. He gets really upset with the religious leaders, and he says, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." And if I could just jump to sort of the obstacle here, I think what Jesus is pointing out is that there's a lot of religious clutter, religious activity that's actually getting in the way of people experiencing an authentic meeting with God. The temple was meant to be God's access point to his people. And so people were to come to the temple in order to experience God. And there was even provision made for the Gentiles, for those who would be considered far from God. Gentiles were not Israelites, but in the temple there was provision made that the Gentiles could even come to have sort of an experience or a meeting with God at the temple. And the place where that was meant to happen was in the court of the Gentiles. And so I don't know how much I'll get into this on Sunday, but what's going on here is that Jesus is overturning the tables of the money changers, and he's getting all upset, and all of this is happening in the court of the Gentiles. And so really what Jesus, part of why he's so upset is that court of the Gentiles was meant for those who are far from God to be able to come and approach God and experience him. But the religious leaders were filling it with religious clutter and religious activity that was actually preventing the Gentiles from being able to experience God. And that was making Jesus upset. This idea of a den of robbers is another interesting image, that if you think of thieves, the den is where they go after they commit the crime. They bring the riches that they've just stolen back to the den so they can hide and not be caught. And so, when Jesus says you're making this place a den of robbers, it's like the religious leaders are hiding in the temple and hiding something from God and hiding from the people. They're robbing themselves and they're robbing the others of an authentic encounter with God. And so the obstacle here is this religious clutter that's getting in the way. And then he goes on, verse 14, it says, "The blind and the lame came to Jesus at the temple and he healed them." And then the children cry out, singing praises to him. And there's this sort of contrast between what Jesus is really upset at and what he really wants the temple to be is this access point, this meeting place with God. And so the life-changing power of God is at work through Jesus to heal the blind and the lame. And he clears out the clutter so that people could come and experience him. So the obstacle here, or a question might be, what's some of the clutter in our lives? Religious clutter or other clutter, but what's some of the clutter that gets in the way of us experiencing the full life of Jesus at work in us? Maybe there's things that we've committed to, activities that we're a part of, commitments we've made, things that we're filling up our life with that are actually robbing us of an authentic experience of the full life of Jesus in us. So that could be a good discussion point. And then the third scene, the final scene, is Jesus curses a fig tree. And he's on his way back to Jerusalem, and I don't have time to really unpack this, but he curses this fig tree. He's hungry and he wants something to eat, and there's no figs on it, no fruit on it, and so he curses the tree. And it's really symbolic of this idea that the nation of Israel has rejected Jesus. And the fig tree represents Israel, represents God's people who've rejected him. And so Jesus, in essence, is rejecting them. He's saying, because you've rejected me, I'm rejecting you. And I'm going to turn to my disciples, and the mission of God is going to advance. And it's going to go beyond the nation of Israel to the Gentiles. And all are going to be invited into this sort of life-changing experience with Jesus. And so the obstacle that we could identify in this passage is this idea of denial or rejection. The religious leaders denied who Jesus was, and they rejected him. They didn't want anything to do with him, and actually this was the beginning of them they'd already been plotting to kill him. This was the beginning of the Passion Week, and within a week Jesus would be put on a cross by these religious leaders because they had rejected him and denied who he said he was. The very people who ought to have seen him were turning on him. But Jesus invites his disciples, he says, if you believe, verse 22, if you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. And I think really what he's saying there is, if you believe, if you give me your full devotion in your heart, in your mind, if you give yourself to me fully and devote yourself fully to me, if you believe in who I am, I will give you my life-changing power. I will give you the full experience of what I can do in your life. You will be able to see me clearly if you give yourself fully to me. So again, a talking point or a discussion point in that part of this passage might be to talk about the times where maybe we've denied Jesus or rejected him, or whether it was in our mind thinking things about him that just can't be true, or if it's in our heart, our heart affection, just saying, I'm not going to commit myself to Jesus. So in whatever ways we've denied or rejected him, we've clouded our vision of him. We haven't been able to see him clearly. And so the response might be, what would full devotion to Jesus look like? If I was to fully engage with him in my mind, if I was to fully give him my heart, what would that look like? And how might my life change? How might I see Jesus differently? How might I invite him more fully into my life? There's lots to talk about from this passage, and I trust that through this discussion you will see Jesus more clearly and experience him more fully. Blessings on you.